Dear viewers of our YouTube channel, welcome. Today we are honored to host a distinguished analyst, lecturer, and researcher, Dr. Marianna Charountaki. Let us begin with our first question. Dear Marianna, I have reviewed your work, The Century of State Building in Iraq, Baghdad, Kurdistan, and the Development of the Constitution. Could you please share with our viewers the core of your research? What have been the key processes in Iraq's state building over the past century? How has the state taken shape, and what role has Kurdistan played in this process, particularly in the context of the development and content of the Iraqi constitution?
First of all, thank you for having me. It is a pleasure, and it's very interesting. I think at this particular moment, any sort of topic, anything related to Kurdistan and the Kurds. This book is an outcome, I think, of an effort, of a collective effort to be able to place maybe the current situation in the broader sort of historical, political sort of context. The need, I think, that it came for this book, and I was very happy to initiate the argument in this book, is coming maybe from this sort of like ongoing effort in order to be able and find a golden mean between or among the different components as these are depicted in the Iraqi constitution that was created back in 2006. Right now, we are talking about disputes when it comes to salaries, when it comes to payments, when it comes to oil, when it comes to Peshmerga. But in reality, I think the core, if you like, of this or these controversies in Iraq that maybe work as an impediment towards state building is nothing else other than the very sort of lack of being able to address the very first lack of addressing the interrelationship among these components that we talk about. So the book is trying basically to say that it is not a matter of space, it's not a matter of Erbil as a space of power or Baghdad as a space of power, because obviously we have a diffuse of this power into sort of other areas as well. We have Suleimania, we have Basra, we have different sort of like regions. And even though the decision making obviously is these two centers, we can tell that the actual problem that dates back before the creation of the Iraqi state in itself, before the 1920s, is how really you are able to accommodate this interrelationship primarily among the Kurds and the Shia Arab and the Sunni Arab rather than anything else. And having said that, we don't mean that other communities do not matter, but I'm talking about those that politically, at least, they are dominant and able to govern Iraqi affairs. So I think the very problem, it does not lie in these sort of like subsequent problems that they are arising, but in the very first fact that we have addressed from the very beginning this sort of controversy problematic as an Erbil versus Baghdad issue, which I guess is not the case. And we have not really looked at how these three components that I just mentioned right now are able to come together into a more sort of effective mode of governance. It is true until now that even though the constitution is good, however, it's not able to address this three-part interrelationship. And that's why here and there I was trying to discuss about, possible alternative modes of governance, which is not really covered in the book as such. And I was talking about maybe developed or evolved modes of governance, such as confederation and so forth. So I think it's really, it's coming back, and it will be always coming back into the agenda when it comes to Iraq as to how we are able really to find ways out towards a sort of more peaceful coexistence. And I don't see, and the book does not see any other way other than trying to accommodate this interrelationship into a different mode of governance, given the fact that the current constitution, even though it might be good, is not been implemented fully until now. So the book is obviously a cross-disciplinary contribution, addressing, the different matters from different perspectives and disciplines. But however, as I try to see it and as I try to put it, the main argument that is trying to be covered is how basically this, which has led to myriad other problems, as these are reflected in the constitution, can be really placed in the center of the attention, and then possibly solved if we want to talk about an Iraqi state through different lenses. Because I think nowadays, we're trying to go back to the sort of the same sort of statement, or to see things through a taboo sort of like way. But there is no sensitive matters right now. Everybody is talking with everyone. We're talking about, especially when it comes to Iraq and the Kurdistan region, about a constitutional entity. So we're talking about recognition, so we're talking about legitimacy. So within this legitimized context, within this frame of Iraq, and without disturbing boundaries and so forth, if that would be a case, I think searching for an alternative mode of governance is maybe the stake that, it has to be really placed on the table of the discussions between the three parts.
Now let me ask you the second question. Based on what you have just described, what are the main objectives and doctrinal foundations of Iraq's foreign policy? What direction is Iraq currently pursuing on the international stage?
I don't think it's a matter of amending, if you like, because there is huge now discussion about how it has to be amended, the current constitutions, looking at Article this, looking at Article that. And given the fact that Article 140, which was actually the basis on which the constitution would be valid, if that would be implemented, it has not happened until now, since 2007. I don't think really it leaves any sort of space of going back to articles. So the point is not really any sort of like amendments, any sort of like patches for me, but a revision of the constitution from the scratch, and a political decision, because everything is based on the political will. Either we are talking about international law or any other sort of like subject, a political will as to how this could be implemented. And then I think, since the constitution is there are many things to be done in terms of its revision rather than amendment.
Dear Marianna, thank you very much. My next question concerns one of the gravest topics, the tragedies of humanity. Around the world, crimes against humanity continue to occur, both in wartime and in civilian life. But there is a specific category of such crimes, defined in international law as genocide. Our viewers, and I personally, are particularly interested in the case of the Kurdish genocide in Iraqi Kurdistan, especially the tragedy of Halabja. Could you please tell us more about this?
If we are talking about the Kurdish genocide, if we're talking about the case of Halabja, if this is the question, I think it's a historical fact. The genocide is a repetitive sort of like modus operandi when it comes to Iraq, and in particular in the case of the Kurds. We saw later what happened during ISIS and the Yazidi genocide. I wouldn't like really to step into other colleagues' fields, because I am not really specialized on genocide as such. But again, I would like to go back and reiterate how much is important what we are doing, all those that at least we are really focusing on non-state actorhood. Because even now, if we go back to the international law, we see that most scholars, most colleagues, that they are focusing on the international law when they are talking about all these cases and they are linked to the genocide. The problem remains that international law is addressing primarily individuals rather than collectives. So I think it's very much important, if we go back and we revise our understanding in the broader concept of international relations, and understand, and this I think is my effort from the very beginning of my scholarship, as to how we need to understand that international relations, which of course has repercussions on international law and other disciplines, is not just a matter of interstate relations. We are talking definitely about interstate relations, since the state remains the prime actor in the international relations system, but equally we cannot ignore the role of the non-state actors of various types and forms, as I tried to introduce a couple of years ago, as well as any other ideational material structures that matter. So I think the understanding of the ontology in international relations and in international law on its own right is very much important, in order to be able to address theoretically, empirically, all these different phenomena that they arise. And right now, because we discussed about Halabja, and Halabja is linked to the issue of genocide that it was repeated. Even sort of recently, I think international law needs really to go back, revisit its own ontology as well, and focus on how really it's important also the consideration of collectives other than the individuals. And I think this is what is bringing not only the Middle East, but in particular the Middle East as an empirical example. All these regional examples is bringing us back to the theory and how we really need to revise. Either we talk from the perspective of foreign policy or international relations or international law.
Thank you, Marianna. Let me move on to the next question. How do you assess the 2003 US invasion of Iraq? Specifically, what impact did this intervention have on the Kurdistan regional government? And secondly, in 2017, a referendum on independence was held in Iraqi Kurdistan. How did this referendum affect the political configuration of the region? What consequences can we draw from it in terms of understanding the future of the Middle East, Iraq, and Kurdistan?
Thank you very much for this question because it's particularly important. Certain times we have a different understanding of things, but in reality, I think these are unfolding in the different form. We discussed about the US foreign policy in the Middle East. We are talking basically about Bush Middle Eastern Initiative back in 2002, 2003, which is basically focused on the transformation of the Middle East. It has been ironic because 1990, the Kurdistan region as an entity, it exists far before that, 1992, and the outcome, obviously, it was the outcome of unexpected events of a humanitarian crisis rather than a policy, I think, in itself. So it's very interesting that back 2002, 2003, we are talking about the seeds of this sort of idea of the transformation of the Middle East as a US initiative, but this never really happened until the 7th of October, which I think it was somehow the beginning, the start of the implementation of this policy. I don't think that the referendum in itself had any sort of consequences. I see it as part, in terms of a historical episode, of a series of developments that they are happening within the same sort of in the same spirit and within the same direction. The Kurdistan movement in Iraq back in the 1960s, 70s was evolved in the 1990s because of regional developments into a solid entity in order to end up in 2006 because of developments in Iraq into a constitutional entity. The Kurdistan referendum, the Kurdish referendum back in 2017 and its outcomes, I think it was completely related to a political will. I guess back then, and I want just to make here a short parenthesis, if the response from Baghdad would be completely different in a more sort of peaceful or negotiating sort of way, we would not see any sort of further outcomes. For example, the 16th of October, why that would have happened. You have a case, you can deal with it politically. So political will for me is a determinant, and if someone has more power than the other, has to sort of be able and demonstrate and has obviously the responsibility of demonstrating this sort of balance. So I think back then the balance was lost only because there was no political will for discussion, regardless of the outcome, based on a fact, the outcome of the Kurdistan referendum, which cannot be ignored. This referendum took place in the disputed territories, and the disputed territories and the people there decided or expressed their will that they would like to be administered by the Kurdistan region rather than Baghdad. This is a very important, I think, point that needs to be taken into consideration into future discussions. But now, as a fact, as a historical episode in itself, I don't think it created any sort of further sort of turmoil other than how it was dealt with and responded, and I think this caused a bit of turbulence thereafter. Now, the transformation of the Middle East, I think it is on the way, but I think it's on the way in a more sort of determined way from the 7th, as I said, of October, rather than throughout this period since the end of Bush tenure of office until recently, because we shouldn't forget that starting not now with Trump, but far before that, 2009, the Obama administration tried to sort of like shift completely its foreign policy approach, discussed about disengagement, put it in the place of the policy of reset, trying to sort of demonstrate a more pacifist sort of approach into how it would be dealing the US foreign policy with the Middle East. Back then, I think it was very confusing, given the fact that the trajectory of the US foreign policy itself from 1945 until that moment was really very consistent. It was determined, it was speedy, and I think somehow this blocked the system in itself. And of course, later on, it didn't help also the internal dichotomy within the US administration following Obama's tenure of office. So I think that the determination of regional actors, such as, for example, Israel, to place a specific agenda, possibly in order to secure its own stability in the Middle East, should be considered. It is a determinant, and I think it's a far more important determinant than Bush 2003 Middle Eastern Initiative, that somehow we saw gradually thereafter that the US foreign policy diverged from this path. So, yeah, considerations, I think, are happening towards similar direction, but maybe through different actors now.
Thank you, Marianna. My next question is the following. Last week, the Prime Minister of Kurdistan, Masroor Barzani, visited Washington, where major agreements were signed. In this context, how is Kurdistan currently perceived within the European Union? Is it seen merely as part of Iraq with autonomous status, or as a political entity within Iraq that can independently engage in international diplomatic, economic, and political agreements?
So this goes back to what we were discussing in our first question about what sort of like relations do we want in Iraq, and how they not we as we, but the actors involved, and what sort of like accommodation of their relations and how they needs to take place. And all of these developments, that they are not new, they are going back to this same sort of question that needs an answer. Now, we talked about the European Union, we talked about US, but we shouldn't forget also like Russia back in 2016, 19. We have also a direct link between the Kurdistan region and the state through Rosneft, the agreements the deals that they took place. At the same time, the EU has its own representation office in the Kurdistan region, and through the work that I have been doing on the EU-KRI relations, we understand that the EU recognizing that there is such a thing as an EU Kurdish policy when it comes to the Kurdistan region. So it means the reality of this entity as a constitutional entity within Iraq creates its own, obviously, create a separate frame that needs to be addressed, simply because we're talking a different ethnically entity that belongs to Iraq, but it's different, is distinctive, since we're talking about federation or whatever, tomorrow about confederation. So these US deals, they are not anything new. I think the only thing that is happening really now is that we can safely discuss about a US Kurdish policy in the same way. And these sort of deals, that they are a continuation of previous deals between the Kurdistan region and the US administration, are but a sort of consolidation of these strategic and institutionalized relations that already back in 2007, 8, 9, I tried to demonstrate it in my PhD, was trying to basically prove that we can talk about institutionalized relations between state and non-state entities. And through this example of the US and the Kurdistan region, I was able to prove it. So we don't talk about anything new, but what we talk about is right now, and of course is not happening now. Even since Obama era, we're talking an explicit US Kurdish policy when it comes to the Kurds in Iraq, to the Kurdistan region. So if all of these international actors recognize the Kurdistan region as a separate entity with whom they have to deal, obviously, because we are talking about a distinctive entity within Iraq, I don't find it something new. On the empirically, this is the case. I think we go back again to the first point of how we are able, what is empirically, territorially happening right now to reflect it on the theory, which I guess in the Iraqi context, it's called constitution. And maybe this is not just for the sake of the Kurdistan region, but also what sort of the rest of Iraq relations they would like to have, given the fact that we remember a few years ago the demonstration in Basra and how much really they wanted this sort of self-rule when it comes to their own region. So I think it's really important, the different components in Iraq, to sit down and decide as to what sort of Iraq they need, and if they need an Iraq that it is confederate as an outcome of this practically, empirical reality, then I think this should be covered on the theory rather than turning a blind eye. And we have really like an underdevelopment and repercussion of the same problems forever. So I think it is a responsibility, and that is again linked to this political will of the components within Iraq to be able and address theoretically what's happening already on the ground.
Thank you, dear Marianna. I have personally been to Baghdad, Iraq, and the Kurdistan region on multiple occasions. That brings me to my next question. I understand you recently participated in a conference dedicated to discussing a book on Iran's foreign policy. This policy has a significant impact on Iraq's internal affairs, both in Baghdad and in the Kurdistan region. In that context, how do you assess the increasing strength of Iran's foreign policy and the growing influence of Ansar Allah, the Houthis? I ask this because our next topic will focus on regional geopolitics. So, in your view, do Iran's foreign policy ambitions and the rise of Ansar Allah have a direct impact on Iraq, the Kurdistan region, and the wider Middle East?
Okay, the Iranian foreign policy itself, it's a separate interview, I think. I'll try to squeeze it so that we can more effective. So I will just try to zoom out, just not talk only about Ansar Allah. When we're talking about the Iranian foreign policy, and here is we're going back to the importance of the non-state actors in the formulation of politics, I think we understand that traditionally Iranian foreign policy, traditionally, I mean the recent sort of past, is utilizing non-state actors in its foreign policy in order to be able and projected this. And we should forget about maybe the example that you raised. A more direct example is the Hashd Shabi in Iraq, which is a direct link. This is the given, and this is the way Iranian foreign policy decides to exercise its own affairs. I will not call it proxies. I will not call it all this because, when you ally with someone else's interest, you are not a proxy. You agree. You are another sort of entity that is having a shared sort of interest. So it's an alliance. So I wouldn't like us to downgrade, because in the literature usually is happening this, the importance of these entities. So this is one, and two, they are not mouthpieces. They believe in something, and they sort of, as I said, their interests align. And number two, when we are talking about these non-state entities, they are entities on their own, right? To the extent that maybe that even within PMF, we could argue that there is such a thing as an independence or an independent group, regardless of projecting their own interests, that maybe they work autonomously from Tehran, not as a majority. Okay, but so we shouldn't downgrade the importance of all these non-state entities as a whole. And so now we need to accept that Iranian foreign policy is working in this way, apart from its own discourse, its own foreign policy principles. This is one, and two, I think we should make, I think, a distinction, because even though there is no such a thing as a shift, but through observation, I think we can talk about a landmark, which is again the 7th of October. Before the 7th of October, Iranian foreign policy was projecting its policies through a more sort of radical way, but now gradually we have seen that even though this sort of intention of preserving this sort of regional dominance and, in terms of discourse, it's still there. A continuous attempt to sort of project power, to sort of consolidate its own sort of territory through the same discourse is a fact. But I think we are seeing a slight shift because today Iran appears a bit less radicalized, and I think here is a very key element. If I think Iranian foreign policy is able to understand that power projection is more legitimate if it's coming from a place of acceptance. That's why legitimacy obviously is important in terms of actorhood in international relations, rather than an illegitimate sort of like space. I think this is a very big win, or it will be a very big win for Iran in itself. So the understanding that being powerful within a legitimate context means a lot more than being powerful within an illegitimate context. And here I think what we're trying to see is a more sort of like, how I would call it, not pacifist as such, but less radicalized implementation of Iran's foreign policy after the 7th of October, which I think is a very good sign. However, the Iranian foreign policy discourse remained the same in terms of playing an important leading role in the region. And maybe traditionally what I have understood through my on Iran and Turkey when I was trying to analyze the Iranian foreign policy pillars is that possibly Iran, even though maybe in practice this is not always possible, would maybe advocate, and maybe it's not against dominance, but it's against when we talk about hegemony. So I think maybe the problem when it comes to the Iranian foreign policy is maybe how the others are able to hegemonize rather than dominate, because obviously Iranian foreign policy is trying to be strong and dominant in the Middle East. But the way always the task is how you are doing that. The modus operandi is very much important. If we want to talk about a stable and lawful international relations arena. Otherwise, we're talking about chaos and continuous conflict. But in the end, to some extent, maybe it could be helpful for some, but in the long run, everyone, maybe it's a loser. So I think we are able to see this shift. Regarding the continuation of the application of the same tools for the preservation of this sort of policy, such as we said, the employ of non-state actors, maybe it will remain the same. But it's very much important whether you are doing it through a sort of lawful context or you are doing it very radicalized one.
Dear Marianna, thank you for your detailed response. But I have two follow-up questions. First, the popular mobilization forces, hashed al-Shabi, have been integrated into the Iraqi state structure and are now financed through the Iraqi national budget. While they are often viewed as an Iranian project, formally they are not solely under Iran's control. How do you assess this dual nature? Second, why is Iran interested in creating such parallel systems, what we might call parallel states or shadow infrastructures? What is the underlying rationale behind this strategy? What is the core logic of this policy?
I'll try to speak as a scholar rather than on behalf of anyone, because I can't. I can't, meaning that I don't have obviously such information. But I would like very briefly to say that the fact that we saw during Maliki's eras from 2014 onwards a mismanagement of the national budget, extensive involvement of Iran and so forth. This is not something that it is helping Iraq or any entity that this would be the case. The fact that the Hashd al-Shabi was incorporated in the Iraqi constitution, the fact that it was constitutionalized by itself, I think, as a irregular policy, I find it particularly important. This caused problems, and in my book, I refer to the impediments of the Iraqi state building. And one of those, and it's a common, I think, sense and knowledge, it was the complete destruction of the Iraqi army. And later on, I think the fact that, you sort of like demolish something built for so many years, I think is very difficult, especially when we're talking about structures like the army, that is one of the most important institutions in the Middle East because it makes win possible. It was very difficult, I think, this to be rebuilt as the US project basically necessitated. And I think the situation got worse when we were talking about this constitutionalization of irregular mechanism of security, because then this led us to a dichotomy between what we call Iraqi army and what we call Iraqi forces, but they ended up to be two different things. And I think this is a case when we are talking about a state that needs and requires to have a solid security apparatus. So by itself, this is problematic. Obviously, money were diffused to different sort of directions, but I think this is the least important. The most important, apart from whatever we would call corruption, is the actual fact that you have the demolition of important sort of institutions such as that, and then later on the split, the fragmentation, if you like, of the security mechanism of the state. This is particularly problematic, and I think one of the reasons that the KRG maybe has been successful, even when it comes to the facilitation of its foreign policy, it's because of this, how we'll call it, of this sort of loyalty to its own guards. Yes, institutionalization still there has not happened, but it's different when we are talking about national units, and it's different when we are talking about irregular, irregular units that they are not necessarily always coming from the society in itself, because I think it would have been very difficult to protect its own boundaries. That's why I think if there would be a day after in Iraq, and if we would be talking about any sort of like confederate model and so on, I think the role of the security and how this would be accommodated with that would be very much important, because if you don't have, in a broader sense, a national and maybe not national, let's call it an Iraqi army able to be able to defend its own territories, but you have militias from here and there, try to pack them up into one sort of like entity, it's problematic into your projections of your own interests. I mean, and I think, in the end, the fact that obviously we have this Iranian interest in Iran because of its population and, an understanding that maybe it is its own sphere of influence, obviously, because of this religious affiliation. And I think that this is not helpful in the long run, because I think it's very much important that the Iraqis to fight for Iraq, the Iranians for Iran, and so forth. I think it's a given that any sort of like, and I will not call it national, any sort of like state entity represent its own self rather than the interest of any other. And I think that would be a red line for any sort of regional entity in the region, and why not for Iraq?
Thank you, dear Marianna. I have a follow-up question, once again related to Syria. In your view, what is the current strategic direction of the Syrian government? Does its internal policy appear to be moving toward federalization, recognizing autonomous regions and ethno-sectarian diversity, or is it still pursuing a unitary, centralized model of governance? What factors are shaping this approach, and how do you see Syria's political future unfolding in the coming years?
First of all, I think the decision of Assad not to continue the war in Syria speed up the process of the day after. Syria was left with current President Bashar, and we have obviously the multi-ethnic mosaic again, because when we're talking about the Middle East, primarily we're talking about different ethnicities, and this is the challenge when it comes to the accommodation of all this into one mode of governance along the lines of Iraq. So we come to the same question of what's happening and how these different components coexist with each other. For sure, I mean, each context is different, but what the Iraqi sort of example demonstrated was that maybe federation does not work. And if in Iraq federation does not work, I'm not sure why federation would work in the case of Syria. So there we have a very sort of clear, specific situation. The creation of Rojava Kurdistan, the Kurdistan of Syria, in a specific sort of territory which is homogeneous, consistent of the Kurdistan, is a fact. However, the liberation of Raqqa, Derzor from ISIS complicated a little bit the situation, because obviously we have in the administration also non-Kurdish territories that they have been included, which I'm not sure to the extent to which this is viable for the long run. In the case of Syria, I think it's up to the sort of components internally to decide what sort of future they need to have. I don't see, again, any other model of governance other than confederation. We are talking about completely different ideologies and ethnicities, and coexistence among all those will end up again into this centralized model that Iraq has suffered since the 1920s until now. Either we're talking about the hegemony or the Shia or the Sunni, over the others, or now the Shia and so forth. So I think internally you need a balance in order to be able and keep distinctive sort of entities but together. So I think maybe confederation is something that it is working in the case of Syria. But however, it's again the issue of the political will, to the extent to which there is an understanding that if this is not going to implement it soon, maybe we will end up with further conflict within. Because look again how, as you said, there was a sort of genocide type targeted violence against, for example, the Druze. And that can happen with any sort of different ethnicity. We shouldn't forget that from the beginning, when the US was involved in the Syria case, on the grounds they were just left with the Kurds. There was not any other ally. And later on, the fact that together the US, the Kurds liberated, and obviously other parts of the society through the SDF forces liberated from ISIS certain territories, the Rojava proved that administration-wise were very effective, and I think even the population in Raqqa, they were acknowledging the fact of the good governance, that they were completely of different background and ethnicity. The interesting thing when it comes, I think, to Syria is that whereas there was this understanding that sectarianism was not there, as is the case of Iraq, and that's why it was pretty much sort of different, and that Syrians primarily, and I'm not talking about the Kurds, that they had a specific hard and situation throughout their presence. The fact that there was not such thing as sectarianism, but maybe majority was feeling sort of like Syrians, is coming now to be sort of disputed, because we see how really these Kurds, that they didn't even have papers or any sort of rights for land or for property and ownership, they are coming now to claim their rights. At the same time, the rest are claiming their own space within Syria the day after. So I think it's forbidden, it's exclusive, it's impossible, I think, any sort of like accommodation other than a situation that everybody can be satisfied to some extent. And I think the only way of doing that is through is through a model that it can ensure, as we said, independent regions, but obviously without spoiling the borders, since this is I think, international sort of taboo. Even though Middle East is an artifact, is artificial. There was no such thing as states along line the Westphalian sort of state system. So if that's the case, and if the problem when it comes to the international sort of players is how these boundaries are not going to be disturbed, I think still a confederate Syria can keep the same sort of like border frame, but at the same time, obviously within the adjustments maybe would satisfy better the different components so that the one is not hijacking the existence of the other. If we talk about coexistence, if we talk about resilience, if we talk about this, roles that they are playing here and there, but in reality, which are those discussions that they can ensure this outcome? So for now, I don't see that this is the case. We see a replication of a model that I'm not sure if it's leading anywhere right now, because I'm not sure what Syria is doing right now as an entity, as a foreign policy, internally. Who are those components represented by the current presidency? It's vague. So it has to be written, it has to be explicit, and it has to be, I think, a consensual existence among those different components. Otherwise, I don't see how less conflict will be able to be achieved in the near future, unless we want conflict.
Thank you, Marianna. My next question is this. Does a so-called Kurdish question still exist in the Middle East today? And if so, how is it positioned within both regional and global agendas? In the context of a strategic triangle involving global powers, especially the United States, regional actors, Iran, Turkey, and Israel, and the Kurds themselves, what kind of future vision is being shaped for the Middle East? What kind of world are they aiming to build? And what role is envisioned for the Kurdish people within that framework?
I'm not sure if I understood correctly the question. If not, correct me. I'm not sure if we need now to answer the question of, first and foremost, if there is such a Kurdish issue. I mean, how the Kurds are related to international relations through their issue. And of course, there are many issues because there are 4 countries where the Kurds are dispersed. So we're talking about 4 different issues that they need a completely maybe different way of looking at it, even though the outcome, it seems to be now the same. I'm not seeing any sort of like triangle which involves Kurdistan as a whole, US and Turkey, and US and Israel.
Marianna, as a scholar and expert deeply familiar with the Middle East and someone who has spent time in the region, how do you perceive the concept of the so-called Greater Middle East project? Do you see this as a real and viable geopolitical strategy, or more as a rhetorical construct without practical substance? And if you do see it as a structured vision, how, in your view, is it being implemented? What political and regional transformations does it bring to the Middle East, particularly in terms of a new security architecture?
I'm not a fortune teller. I'm sure not even the players themselves they exactly know how this is going to unfold. I did write about when I was referring to the Gaza conflict when this broke out. I referred to this triangular relationship between Iran, US, and Israel. And obviously, developments within this triangle, yes, they will affect what will be happening with the Kurds in the Middle East. I'm not sure if the transformation of the Middle East is linked to a broader, maybe even project of weakening of the Arab states and the non-Arab entities in the Middle East. But whatever it is, I think it starts to be unfolding now. I don't think it's a matter of, like we believe or we don't believe. We see that first and foremost, the weakening of the Arab state has happened. It is the case. And I guess now it might be coming also the turn of the non-Arab states in the Middle East, namely Turkey and Iran. And I think before and after the 7th of October, this de-radicalization on behalf of the Iranian foreign policy, maybe it's an indication of that. And maybe what is happening now with regards to the Kurdish issue in Turkey, because when we are talking also about the PKK, let's say, problem, according to the Turkey state, is very much linked to the Kurds overall. It's interesting because it somehow responds to what we have just said. And maybe if this is a policy that it is in place, maybe a long time ago, now it is something that it is unfolding. I'm not sure of the extent to which the Arab uprisings tried initially to do that as an outcome, but now I think it's it's definite that yes, we see the weakening of the Arab state. Yes, we try to see maybe a different sort of like approach when it comes to the non-Arab states in the Middle East. And as I said, uh, the questioning of and the revisiting of the internal order of all these different entities maybe is an answer to this, but this is also linked to a very, I think, straightforward case, the Kurdish case. I mean, as the Palestinian case, they were looking to sort of restore their position in international law for the coming sort of century, for the past century. So it's a little bit sort of tricky to see it only in one way, because obviously on the other way we have prolonged issues in the Middle East, like the Palestinian, like the Kurdish issue, that they are trying all these years, all these decades, this century, to find their own resolution. So it's a combination, I think, of factors. It's just I don't think it's just in one way, but all this maybe yes lead to a different landscape.
Dear Marianna, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. You've shared your academic insights and your profound, systematic perspective on the Middle East. Our audience consists mainly of people from academic and expert communities, those who reflect, research, write, read, and travel extensively. What would you like to say to them in closing, from your own experience, both as a professional and as a person?
I'm happy. Thanks again for the invitation. I'm very much happy to get connected. I just only want to say, and I think a part of my, let's say, story, if I can summarize it, my work, my research, is how to basically bridge the gap between the international and the regional scholarship. And I think that if we all understand that we are part as scholars of the same world, and if what we do is basically an attempt to construct rather than to deconstruct and help to this construction in the different regions we are focusing on. As I said, since world is one, I think this is the ultimate that we can do based on the fact that our work should basically contribute to this global peace that we are aspiring. That's why we're discussing about issues. That's why we're offering solutions for different viewpoints. So I think overall, the point is that how we are able as one to discuss these matters, because these matters do not belong to Iraq, do not belong to Russia, do not belong to Greece. They belong to the world. And since we are world citizens, I think we have this obligation through our profession. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Mariana. You're welcome.